Hello, and welcome to this recording of Chapter 10 Market Strategy on Managing of Channel Power. Before we do that, first, I'd like to give you a little narrative of, of, um, of the uses of power. So, fascinating discussion of Walmart way back when they started. Amazingly enough, Walmart started doing their magnificent supply chain stuff as far back as 1975 when they started using their IBM 370 to control their inventory. In 1990s, Walmart started to initiate what was called their vendor management inventory. And one of the fascinating things about the managed inventory is that vendors became responsible for managing their own products in Walmart's warehouses. Um, how were they able to do this? Well, Walmart basically required them to spend enormous amounts of money in terms of computer hardware and internet. Well, not internet at that time, but dial-up connections to be able to connect to Walmart's main computer systems. Well, what did they get out of that? Well, the vendor managed inventory system that Walmart did allowed their vendors to be able to see all of their inventory that was stacked in every Walmart all across the world in real time. It meant that they unprecedentedly were able to see all of the goods that were in every Walmart, and they were able to manage them. Um, Walmart did this for two reasons. One of them is to become more efficient themselves. The other is that they would, by exercising this, making their vendors do this, actually make everything in the entire system better just by doing this. It was a very interesting kind of use of power to get their particular vendors to do this. Um, this is an example of power when it is used for the good, and it is important as a way of understanding that power is not a bad thing. Power can be an enormously good thing if we understand power and we know how to use it efficiently. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and we're going to start talking about power. So, what is power? So, the first thing to note is that every element of marketing channels is permeated by some use of some consideration of power. Realize that power is a difficult thing to measure, and many times you can't look at it as being equivalent or that one power is equal to another. Just realize that what power is the ability to alter behavior, the ability to set a course and have individuals follow that particular that particular pathway. Power is the potential for influence, but it isn't until you actually exercise power. When you exercise power, you're exercising influence. When it's worked in the right way, it can be important. When power is done in the short term, it can be disastrous. And so, without further ado, let us look at what the definition of power is. Power is the ability of one channel member A, who was known as the influencer, to get another channel member B, which is known as the target of influence, to do something it ordinarily would not have done. And so you are altering behavior on whoever you're trying to influence, usually for some goal. The goal can be personal to you, or it can be to the entire system. It can be one or the other. Realize this is that, as I said before, it's a potential for influence, but it may not necessarily be. Power is a very difficult thing. Power is very difficult to diagnose and understand because many times you have what are called false positives. It's quite possible that you can ask, or you as a manufacturer could be asking the downstream partner to lower their price. In other words, their retail price to a consumer. They might actually lower their retail price to a consumer, but they may not actually be under your influence. It's possible that they are lowering prices to be able to meet market demand at a certain price level. And so that can be a part of a potential for influence or a false positive because you think that you're having influence when in essence there's some other environmental reason why you're being influenced. You can also have what's known as a false negative. In other words, you think you can be pursuing your own particular purposes, but you're actually being influenced by the influencer without even knowing it. So you can be acting under the influence of your partner, not knowing it, but thinking you're pursuing it for your own personal reasons. That's a false negative. All right. So remember this, you may be acting in your own economic self-interest without even knowing you're being under influence. This is one of the difficulties that power is hypothetical, it's speculative, it can be impossible to verify, yet we do know that power exists. So realize what is the best use of power? When is power used to its maximum benefit? All right. If you are maximizing your benefit as an individual member in the system, that is not necessarily the best use of power. As a matter of fact, it can be disastrous because the influence of power to give you a greater value than one of your partners ultimately can backfire in its own way. You can have your partners who try to influence as well when you are the only one who's benefiting. The maximizing of systems profits is not the same as maximizing each member. All right. Realize that the best use of power is when you do it for the good of the system rather than the good of a single member. Realize that the usage is up to the decision maker. It is that person ultimately who decides whether or not power is real, whether it has strength or not. So without further ado, I'm going to kind of look around here, and I'm just going to grab something. I'm going to grab this pencil here, all right? Now, you can't see it very well with the way the background works, but you can kind of see this pencil end against my jersey. Now you can see it. Now, does this have power? I mean, is this good or bad? Well, actually, the truth is its usage determines its goodness or badness. Power, like this, is a value neutral system. It in itself has no power. It is in the use or your purpose that determines ultimately whether it is good or not. I talk about cryptocurrencies and non-fungible tokens. We all know about them as well. If you don't know really, cryptocurrencies have been talked about as an enormous tool of good. It's possible it is being able to use to fund individuals who perhaps live in a dictatorship or despotism who can't be able to go out and borrow funds. Yes, that can happen in currency. But if any of you have heard the discussion of FTX, I would like for you to watch this little clip that I have that'll give you an idea of what's going on in FTX right now, and it'll kind of give you a little bit of an understanding of what is exactly going on with FTX and kind of explain to you their illegality. So this is called the FTX collapse in 99 seconds. Why? Okay, just think of cryptocurrencies as any other commodity that's traded. That'll help. Okay, so listen. Um, for those of you, I tried to pause that there. If you don't know who this is, look it up. It's Elizabeth Holmes, and she was a billion-dollar CEO of a company called Theranos. I urge you to look at that and get an idea of, you know, that whole idea about good or bad. Okay. So without further ado, let me go on. So I'm sure you found that quite interesting. Is a quick 99 seconds about the FTX collapse. What I wanted to use this is just basic. Oops, excuse me. No, I don't want to hear about cold fusion. By the way, cold fusion is an excellent page as well. Um, what I wanted to say is that there is the potential for good, enormous good in the use of cryptocurrencies, but you can see in this instance that it was used for bad. All right. I'm trying to say this to circle around to the point to understand that power is value neutral. It is in its use that you determine its goodness or badness, for the lack of a better word. What makes power good, or let's just say what is its better use or its best use of all, is when power is used to create system-wide advantages. When it's written for the good of the system, you can find or it can have great value. So without further ado, we're talking about power. Let's talk about what the five sources of power are. Now, way back, I believe, what is it? Ben and French, I believe, are the names of the original people who wrote about the five sources of power. Power has been done and overdone, especially in marketing channels. There was a time there in the 90s where every journal order that you could ever find had something to do with power in it, to the point where the journal market said, we're not publishing anything more that has anything to do that it exists. If you look into books on leadership psychology, these five sources of power are all out there. And so we look at these five sources of power as unique, discriminant, and parsimonious. They cover everything that you want to know. And so, without further ado, we're going to look at these as the five sources of power. They are reward, coercion, expertise, reference, and legitimacy. Legitimacy also is legitimate power. Okay. Reference also is referent power. You can use either of those on the test and you'll get the points for it. But let's talk about these powers one at a time. The first is reward. Reward power is any benefit that is given in return for a channel's member agreement to alter their behavior. If you do what I want, I'll give you a cookie. If I were to tell my daughter that. Usually the emphasis is on a financial reward in the distribution channel systems, but it can be anything. Just realize that anything that you provide as a reward, whether it is non-financial or financial, would be considered the work or the use of power. It can be done in various forms. Usually it's some kind of effort to boost sailors' capability of increasing products or the profits. You can actually do this upstream or downstream. Either one of these is possible. The difficulty, of course, with reward power is that there's the expectation for rewards always. These are the only ways that you're going to get consumers or get your channel partners to move away. Realize this, that the ability to give rewards is insufficient. The influencer must be willing to grant the reward, and you must give them if the party of influence or who you're influencing does alter their behavior. You must reward. You can't simply withhold it. Now, one of the things that's difficult at all is the temptation is to take all of, other than coercive power, but all the rest of these and say, well, there's some kind of reward for going into your behavior. That is true in a way, but these five sources of power are unique into themselves. They are what I would say is mutually exclusive. In other words, they're nothing that they aren't, and they're collectively exhaustive. They are everything that they are. And so the reward power is any benefit, non-monetary or otherwise, in return for a channel member's agreement to behavior. Now, coercive power can sometimes be misunderstood. Coercive power can be thought of as being the flip side of reward, but in many ways it's not. So coercive power stems from B, okay, the party of influence, their expectation of punishment by A, the influencer, if they fail to conform A's influence. You would like to say that is the flip side, but the difficulty with that, of course, is that coercive power is extremely dangerous and should only be used as a last resort, because coercive power is synonymous with the potential to threaten another. It is a negative sanction that creates more than just the absence of rewards. It can be thought of as an attack upon themselves and their business. And the difficulty with an attack in a coercive way is that it invites retaliation. B might fight back. And so you have to be very, very careful about it, because coercion power erodes the relationship, even if it does so slowly that the influencer fails to realize it. What you've done is you've thrown an acid bath on the relationship in coercive power. It takes much time trying to rebuild trust in a coercive relationship when A pulls the trigger and punishes B. And so that's why it may be the flip side of that, but I certainly think that its power is much more difficult, much more dangerous than it might seem. The next is expert power. This is also expertise power. So what expert power is, it's based on the target's perception that the influencer has some kind of special knowledge or expertise. When you first start a partnership, with a channel member. Usually this channel member has some kind of specialized skills or knowledge that is important for you in your ability to survive and grow. And so what you want to be able to do is work with that individual, be able to gain knowledge. Well, the difficulty with that is that this is a power that can disappear in an instant. All right. So the power can be divided into expertise, the ability to make good judgments, and that could be part of the expert's power, or the provision of data or the knowledge that that particular influencer A has. So it can be both of those things at the same time. If you ever look at any of the influencer, those individuals that you would consider special, usually they have the ability to make good judgments and also they have excellent information. It's not very easy to use. First, a channel member has to be very trusted. Usually, the experts are accorded some very high status. But the difficulty, of course, is that independent minded entrepreneurial business people don't like to be told what to do. The other part of this is difficulty is why does it disappear? Quite simply, what it is when the knowledge is readily available. And I think this is one of those things that we see, especially in the internet. When I was a first year salesman coming up and was doing this for the first time, and I was selling computers in Lafayette, I had this bad habit of saying much more than I should. Um, I was impressed with my own knowledge far too much that I felt like I wanted to share it. And what happened is I gave away a lot of information that other people use to go and buy their goods. And it's one of those mistakes that you make when you're a young salesperson that you also want to be able to show your knowledge. Might be a little bit of vanity. I have nothing wrong problem with saying that. But the difficulty is that how do you use and keep that expertise or that expert power? Well, there's three things that you can do to keep that. One of them is you can dole it out in small portions. You can retain that vital information to be able to continue that particular dependence. So, in other words, you tell part of the script, just enough to get your partners to move down to the next line. The next is that I can continually invest in my own personal knowledge and learning so that I'm always the individual who's the expert, who always knows more than anyone else. This is what I did, especially when I was in my 20s, when I was working at Radio Shack, and then when I worked at Omni Computer Store in Lafayette, is that I spent a lot of time reading constantly, always looking at what the new products were. It helped me in many ways because it allowed me to be able to build my own knowledge and be able to grow, especially in that particular field, which I enjoyed. The next is, or the third thing is that I only transmit customized information that is directly to the channel partners so that they can invest in some transaction specific expertise. Now, what does all that gobbledygook mean? It means that when a consumer is coming in to be able to buy a particular good, I only give the information that has to go with moving that sale along. It has to be very specific to the transaction and not in some kind of general broad approach where you might, in essence, give away the store without knowing. So, expert power is strong, it is valuable, it is important, but it can go away at any second. The next is legitimate power. Legitimate power is actually split into two types of power. So, legitimate power or legitimacy as well stems from the target company's sense that they are the B is in some way obligated to comply with the request of the influencer A, that there's some kind of obligation. Now, there's two types of legitimate power. There's first what is known as legal legitimate power, and this is that next line. Legal legitimate power is conferred by governments stemming from each nation's laws of contracts and commerce. Usually, these are tied up in fixed contracts that have very specific guidelines about what are the responsibilities for both parties. This is legal legitimate power. Traditional legitimate power is that when it exists in dealings between organizations that come from the norms and the values of their beliefs. A norm is an expectation for normal behavior. And so a norm says, I should pay my balance in full. I need to pay my debts. I must make sure to pay within 10 days my bills. Those are what are considered to be norms. And where legal legitimate power is spelled out in contract, traditional legitimate power is spelled out in a basic way of acting so that you act in an equitable and forthright manner. So I am going to give you a difference between those two. Traditional, excuse me, yeah, legal legitimate is conferred with contracts that come from legal legalities of whatever society you're in. Realize that the traditional legitimate power also requires the compliance of the the subject of influences beliefs. All right, the subject of influence must believe that those norms mean something to them. In order for it to work, you have to have them buy in. So I'll give you an example. So I've talked about when I was an ISP and I had about 1,800 customers and I was doing pretty well. And then Walmart jumped in with $4.95 dial-up internet, and basically it was all over. Now, I lost about 300 customers and was trying to be able to renegotiate the contracts on the number of lines that I had coming in. I had 276 lines. There's no way I needed that many. I needed to drop at least 4 trucks, if at all possible. But South Central Bell, they were my contract holders. They said nothing doing. You signed up for 3 years. You must pay every month. You know, you are obligated under all of those things, and you must pay. You started owing on every single contracts, and it got worse and worse every month. It was coming up to be quite a bill. And they kept saying over and over again that I had to finish those bills, and I was paying 18, 20,000 a shot, and I still wasn't able to keep up. I finally went to my lawyer, Forrest Danton. Forrest Danton was also the circuit clerk or circuit judge in the small town that I was in. Super guy. He did all my legal, gave him high speed internet, gave him DSL. And that's how we traded between each other. And this was probably one of the worst moments of my life. I mean, I was basically being tracked down to the point where I was going to have to basically have, it was impossible for me to be able to pay this. And I didn't know what to do. I knew that I was at this point where I was going to go out of business, but with everything else that I had, I was going to be owing these people. So Forrest Danton looked at me and uttered the F word. And I went, excuse me. And he said, David, I wrote your corporation. You are nothing but an officer of the nation. All of the debts that are incurred are incurred by the corporation and you personally. So go ahead and get whatever you can out of the corporation and move on. So this is an example of both powers. legal legitimate power said that they had those contracts and I was going to have to uphold those contracts for 3 years. They also said by the norms, you should pay your bills. That was traditional legitimate power. Forrest Danton said to me, you have no legal obligation whatsoever because you don't own anything. You're only an officer of the corporation. That was an example of legitimate power. They were forcing me by norms, the norms that say to me that I should be paying my bills, when the truth was I owed nothing whatsoever. And so with that, I was able to go on with my life. But this is an example of legal legitimate and traditional legitimate. It should be also stated later, now I'll say this, that some powers are mediated versus unmediated, and I'll explain those in a minute, right? The last one of those is referent power. And reference power exists when B, the target of influence, views A, the influencer, as a standard of reference and therefore wishes to identify publicly with A. There's an undeniable existence that this is true. When I was working at Omni Computer Store, I worked very badly after we had lost a couple of our IBM compatible systems, compact data products, not compact, data products. And I really, yeah. And I started on that process and I eventually left. But the referent power, putting 3 big blue letters on your particular front door, are unmistakably powerful. And that's what referent power is. You want to be able to carry certain brands. You pride yourself on having those brands in certain outlets, especially when you're the only ones. When I was at Con Appliances in Lafayette, we were extremely proud to be selling Mitsubishi televisions at those times because, especially with live broadcasts, the Diamond Vision was unbelievable, bright and clear at that time. And so, referent power is the desire to be referenced with those particular individuals. Now, just realize this is that there's a couple of ways of grouping those particular powers. Okay. So one is a coercive power, one in which you are forced into it, and the others are non-coercive. Coercion can be difficult because usually it's the removal of something a channel member already has and you're taking it away from them. Everything else is non-coercive. That one power, coercive power, is taking away something that already exists, and that can be difficult. Mediated versus unmediated power is 2 different types, all right? So mediated power is when the target is forced to acknowledge their power basis, and this is reward proof. It is coercion power, and then it is also legal legitimate. You have to acknowledge these powers existing. They are basic. These are also known as what are known as position powers. Okay, by their basic nature and place where they have power. Unmediated are powers that don't exist without my perception. I believe they're powerful, and therefore they have power. Me, right? That's unmediated. So this is expert power, or in other words, expertise, where I accept them as having a special knowledge or skill. This is a referent power, where I wish to be known as working with these individuals. And then finally, traditional legitimate power, where the expectations of acting in a particular manner, norms, those are what gives it power. And so This is how all of they act together. It is very important to note, once again, I want to say this again, mediated power, position power, are acknowledged powers that you have no ability to say whether or not they are there. Unmediated powers only exist with the target's perception. All right, the target acknowledges it, and that's what gives it its. Now, to understand power and the strength of power, we have to recognize also that there is, in essence, a flip side or a another factor in here that is a major determinant of power, and that is the concept of dependence. And so, what is dependence? Well, let's look at what dependence is. Dependence basically is when B recognizes that they depend more heavily on A. But what are the parameters in which dependence exists? Well, dependence happens when B gets a greater utility, value, benefit, satisfaction from A than A gets from B. The other is that when B has fewer alternative sources to the utility that A brings. And so this leads us to this particular formula that we're looking at, in which D U times S. And so dependence equals to the utility, the value and benefits that they get from A, multiplied by the alternative scarcity of that particular thing that A brings. It's very good to think about one actor's power as another actor's dependence, because it allows you to focus on the two things that are important. What does it bring that gives it its power? How easy is it to be replaced? And if you understand those two things, then the whole idea of how power ultimately works, it's a little bit easier for you to understand. So, how do you access utility? Well, let's assume you are the focal actor and you need to tally up the benefits that your firm offers. So one of the things is you recognize your channel partner's goals. You look at how the offering that you have helps meets those pursuits. If you look at that, that's the first way that you can understand what benefits your particular corporation brings. The next is scarcity. Who are your potential competitors? Who are out there that can be replaced easily by you? If you can get that, you can determine how easily the channel member switch from your organization to a competitor. Now, in the cell phone industry, they don't have scarcity, but they try to replicate it by increasing the cost of switching. And so the dependence happens because of a little bit of coercive power working into the system. And so that kind of gives you an idea of both the scarcity and excuse me, your value. All right. When you reveal the dependence your channel partner has on you, you can ultimately get an idea of how your channel partner, you know, needs you and how much power you have. So, what are some practical ways that you can look at if you're trying to guess or assess your own power? One of them is the percentage of sales or profits that you contribute to your partner. The higher the percentage, the higher the partner's dependence on you, and thus more power you have as a member, right? Now, the problem, however, is that if you capture all the benefits, it doesn't assess scarcity directly. And so you kind of miss out on that, right? The next is your performance as a partner in your relationship with your channel partners. If you are superior to your channel partner in knowledge, in expertise, in how your partner wishes to be with you, then you have some greater superiority in your particular role performance. When I was in Lafayette, um, I worked with several distributors in Houston, and there was a certain air of cockiness about the way that they act with every good reason, because they had both referent and expertise power that I certainly didn't have. So, greater superiority, greater higher role performance, and realize that service excellence, how well you complete things, confers a uniqueness even in commodity products. If any of you have had good repair people that fix things the first time and don't break them, those individuals are valuable. And yes, you depend on those people and need it. So the last way that you can do this is just do a bottom-up approach, inventory all the 5 sources, and the extent to which the target makes the change varies with the level of dependence on the influencer. It gives you a rough idea of just how valuable your services are. Now, realize power is not a property of the organization, but the relation. Power depends on relationships. Realize that dependence is also never one way. There can be asymmetric dependence in which one side has some sort of superiority to another, but you have to understand that your power is only powerful in relation to relationship. So you have to be able to measure it in a net dependence way. You will find ultimately that one partner is. So they use this example of the SAB Brilling offering a large market with relative ease, but they only had 30 wholesalers in Kenya versus the 470 wholesalers they had in the United States. But that East African breweries achieves 98% market coverage because of their high strength. And so there's a high mutual dependence between the SAB of Miller and the East African breweries. They allow them to have a much greater strength, and that ultimately creates a greater dependence. Now, as I said before, the balance of power is never perfect. There's usually some kind of imbalance. The more dependent member is always in danger of suffering some form of exploitation. Certainly, you can say that Walmart gave a lot back to its vendors, but it was an enormous cost as well. So there's difficulty because, especially if the more powerful partner exerts some influences that may be considered almost to the extreme side, the weaker member may suffer because of the fortunes of the stronger member if they go down. And so this mutual dependence ultimately has to do with their success and failure at the same time. But there has to be some kind of mutual benefit, because asymmetrical relationships, ones that are severely off each other, tend to be more conflict laden. They tend to be less trusting. They're less committed to some kind of personal working together. And yet it exists. Asymmetric relationships do exist, and they all have their own difficulties. So if you're in an asymmetric relationship and this dependence is tending to be too much, to the point where you consider that you're going through some form of exploitation, what are the measures that you have? What can you do? Well, the first thing that you can do is develop alternatives to A, which is generally the most common thing to do. You might have to add on another supplier, perhaps get your things from a third party, perhaps even a second wholesaler as well. All of these, any alternative that they can is generally some way of being able to lessen the influence that they have. All right. So that's why you do it. The next thing that you can do is organize a coalition of Bs, the targets of influences, to attack As. Usually, this also requires you to bring in a third party in one or another. So, the example that they give here is that in the 50s, General Motors was looking for a way of vertically integrating forward. In other words, in select markets, what they were considering to do is that they were going to bypass their dealers over completely and go service those particular organizations or even industries in a more direct manner. As I've said before, the um, um, the automobile dealers are franchises. In other words, they own their own stores. What the GM automobile dealerships did, because they saw this as so grave that General Motors was going to vertically integrate, they got on their horse. They formed a coalition, and that coalition went and basically, although they did not give a threat or else, they certainly had strength together in numbers that GM simply couldn't ignore. The last is that you just might exit the situation and no longer seek the benefits that A needs anymore. Just basically cut it off. You're done. All right. You withdraw from the business and therefore from the relationship. Um, Walmart has done this to dependent manufacturers over and over again, sometimes to the point where organizations simply drop out, they get out of the way, and they have nothing else that they can do. Doesn't always work, but it is unusual, excuse me, to see that the bees will move on to something completely different. More often than not, in terms of tolerating imbalanced dependence, more often than not, a dependent party simply accepts the situation. As a matter of fact, in a weaker market, or in a weaker position, if it's a predictable market, you may not make any moves at all. A predictable market, even if you're the weaker partner, is a constant stream of revenue that is to your advantage. So you might be more than happy to accept margins that you wouldn't take from someone else, as long as it keeps the bills paid, the lights are on, and it's paid for. It might be in a predictable market. In an uncertain market, high mutual dependence is preferable to ensure that both sides are motivated to try to come up with exotic and best ways of coming up with solutions to the stocking issues. Now, in an uncertain market, you are going to have higher mutual dependence, because the uncertainty of the market means that the number of corporations that you trust dwindle to a limited few. And that's why you need to be able to um, take, or excuse me, be able to be motivated to work more closely together. The last part of this agenda is the discussion of what are called power-based influence strategies. Okay, so we understand power, we understand its relationship, we have an understanding of where the value level of power. How do we go about using this, they're actually exercising it. It's important to understand that power is invisible, that you have to have powers. If you have power, you have to use it. And so, what you have to find a way is, how do you actually communicate that power? Through our channel relationships. Well, you have what are called the 6 categories of influence strategies. These are ways of creating conversations that ultimately will achieve the good things that you wish. And so, without further ado, let's talk about it. So, the first channel promise of channel communication is the promise. The promise is the exercise of reward. What we wish, we will reward you. That is the first of the conversation. Um, Realize also that there's a difficulty with this because, of course, in the reinforcement situation, what can happen is that you will do it and you have the expectations of reward every time you do it. The next is the threat, of course, the power. Quite easily as the communication strategy, if you don't do what we wish, we will. Once again, coercive strategies are very much the last resort. They open you up for retaliation. They can create damage. The next is do what we wish because you have agreed to do so. This is an example of a traditional legitimate power where the expectations of norms in the society in which you live in say that you have agreed to do what we wish, and the expectation is that you're going to follow. A request is a little bit different. A request is like, please, and it has to be do more with the norms in a society. Um, I should say, excuse me, that in legalistic, because you have agreed to do so, that could also be legal legitimate power because you've already made the agreement, and of course, the agreement has must be some way of being codified. The request is, please do it, and be thought of in many ways as legal legitimate, is that I'm asking you. In a normal society, to be asked, there is some form of obligation to complete whatever it's for. The last two are the most difficult, take the most time, but may be the most valuable. The first is the information exchange. The information exchange is almost an implied consent. And basically what this does is it tries to lay things open in a general discussion way. But basically what you're doing is you're steering the particular conversation in a particular way. This can be mostly expertise power, where you share your knowledge and your judgment of the way things you expect to be. And this information exchange basically comes down to showing the information that you have that makes their decision on doing what you wish them to do. The last is recommendation. We really think this is the best thing for you. This can be thought of as referent power, where someone higher up with more skill, more understanding the issues than you, basically states they want you to do this for your best interest. Well, the problem with that is that I have my own best interests. I don't need anyone else telling me. And it does tend to generate skepticism and counter arguments, especially when the recommendations may be given without any valid arguments whatsoever, other than quite simply saying, you got to do it. And so realize this is that every channel of communication is also grouped with some form of channel power. And so when we talk about the communication strategies are the execution to try to bring influence, and hopefully that influences, come from your own people. So The effectiveness of all of the strategies, while a promise, the threat, and the legalistic influence often provoke a backlash and sometimes even contempt. Because quite simply, you're using position, okay? You're using their position in the situation. It's a very transaction-oriented thing where there is the tendency of being unfeeling for your own given issues, and that's why it doesn't request the information exchange and the recommendation strategies are much more subtle than nuanced and maybe take much longer to get working and much more difficult to come up. The implication sometimes is they're not going to come up with the recommendation that you hope they do. All right. And Western countries tend to be more subtle in their influence. They require more interpersonal relationship quality and as the instead of the overt influence strategies because they resist resentment. That is very much Western culture and in the United States. If you find in Asian cultures, they don't necessarily go along with it. They tend to be very transaction oriented, where you can see the effects as good or bad or indifferent, and they may not take this personally at all, or may not risk any resentment because they may not have any. All right. And just remember that coercive power in one in culture can be legitimate in others. Things that we might consider to be rude, personal, in other countries and cultures might simply be, of course, why not? What is important in how successful you are can be termed around the valence. And so the valence is what is the overall good that you get from doing this particular good thing? It's a positive reinforcement. How much value do you have? And so those good properties that come out of the experience, the valence, the positive reward, you can have a positive valence, but then realizes that you can have a negative valence as well, which is in the problems that you would have in terms of an influence strategy. It can be the withdrawal of support instead of the punishment as well. And so in doing what I wish, if you take on this particular product, I will give you a substantial amount of marketing support to help you achieve success. If you don't take it on, you're not going to get that substantial marketing effort. And so that's an example of failures. The last in terms of communication strategy is contingent or non-contingent. So basically what you're saying is it's an if-then statement if you're looking at it in terms of a computer term. If you take on this new product, we will give you our distributor of the year. So in other words, you're basically saying that to get this award, it is contingent upon you doing this particular item. The final condition, the non-contingent condition is you're not telling them the product, you're giving them the distributor award off, and then hopefully in a non-contingent way, because you've given this, is that you're going to have a much greater willingness for your partners to perform in a successful way. And so that's what a non-contingent is. You're giving them the reward, whereas contingent is basically saying, if you do what I tell you, you get that distributed to your award. And so these are the final ways to have framing influence strategies. Okay, just remember that power is the ability for one individual or organization to alter another individual organization. Well, how do you translate power into influence requires communication, the strategies. Negative or contingent framing is usually inferior to positive or non-contingent framing, mostly because those are uplifting in value, whereas negative or contingent frame is a non-negative. It is a non. Just remember the last thing is that the interdependence of channel members, not just dependence by itself, but the mutual dependence is ultimately what makes power a critical feature in their function. Because the more you need each other, the more the ability that you have power to ultimately bring something. All right. Just remember the definitions of power and dependence, the 5 sources of power, the importance of balance, independence, those 6 communication strategies and how they relate power for converting that power into influence, and then how the framing influence drives the target reaction. Okay. All right, folks, that is it with chapter 10. We will be seeing you for chapter 11. I hope you have a very good week, and thank you very much for listening.